The ocean liner slowed as it neared the dock. Tintin gripped the rail. Snowy sat alert at his feet. Chicago spread wide under a gray sky. Smoke rose from distant factories. The boy stepped onto American soil for the first time. His suitcase felt heavier than before. A watchful silence hung over the pier. Customs officers moved through the crowd. Passengers hurried past with tired faces. Tintin waited his turn. He scanned the line of waiting cars. One black sedan stood apart from the others. Its windows were rolled up tight. A driver in a fedora sat motionless behind the wheel. Snowy gave a low whine. Tintin patted the dog's head. They moved forward together. The customs man stamped the passport without a word. Tintin collected his papers. He stepped into the open air again. The wind carried the smell of the lake. It also carried the faint scent of cigarette smoke. Two men leaned against a stack of crates nearby. Their eyes followed every step Tintin took. One adjusted his coat collar. The other kept a hand inside his pocket. Tintin kept walking at an even pace. Snowy stayed close to his heel. The dog's ears stood straight up. Tintin crossed the wide concrete apron of the port. Taxis honked in short bursts. Porters wheeled heavy trunks on rattling carts. Still, the two men remained in place. Their gaze never left him. A third figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. He wore a gray suit and carried no luggage. Tintin felt the weight of their attention like a hand on his shoulder. Tintin felt the weight of their attention like a hand on his shoulder. He reached the street beyond the port gates. Tall buildings rose on every side. Elevated trains rattled overhead. The noise of the city pressed in, yet the sense of being followed grew sharper. Tintin turned a corner at a measured speed. He glanced back once. The man in the grey suit had matched his turn. The black sedan now idled at the curb half a block behind. Snowy barked once, sharp and short. Tintin quickened his step without running. He crossed another street. The grey-suited man kept pace on the opposite sidewalk. Tintin ducked into the shadow of an awning. He waited. The follower slowed but did not stop. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The man looked away at once. Tintin resumed his walk. Chicago felt larger and colder than he had imagined. He reached a modest hotel near the river. The lobby smelled of polished wood and old cigars. Tintin signed the register. The clerk handed over a key without comment. Upstairs, the room overlooked a narrow alley. Tintin set the suitcase on the bed. Snowy jumped up and circled once. From the window, Tintin could see the grey-suited man standing on the corner below. The man lit a match and held it to a cigarette. The flame flared and died. From the window, Tintin drew the curtain halfway. He sat on the edge of the bed. America had greeted him with open streets and hidden watchers. The danger had begun the moment his feet touched the dock. Snowy settled at the door with one eye still open. Outside, the city noise continued without pause. Inside the room, the quiet felt heavy. Tintin listened to the distant rumble of trains. He knew the night ahead would not be still. Tintin knew the night ahead would not be still. He rose from the edge of the bed. Snowy lifted his head but stayed quiet. The young reporter checked the small notebook in his coat pocket. Names and addresses filled its pages. They pointed to the heart of the city's hidden world. Tintin crossed to the window. Street lamps cast long shadows below. Cars moved in slow lines. He turned back to the room. "Stay here, Snowy," he said. The dog gave a low whine but settled again. Tintin pulled on his hat and stepped into the hallway. The elevator carried him down with a soft hum. At the lobby, he nodded to the clerk. Outside, the air felt cooler than before. He walked toward the address he had circled earlier. It belonged to a man who knew the gangs. The streets grew narrower as he went. A single light burned above a basement door. Tintin knocked twice. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened a crack. An older man peered out. "You're the one from the boat," he said. Tintin nodded. He followed the man down a short flight of stairs. The room below smelled of smoke and old paper. Maps lay spread across a table. The man pointed to a red circle on one map. "They meet here after midnight," he whispered. Tintin wrote the street name. A floorboard creaked above them. Both men froze. The older man pushed Tintin toward a side door. "Go now," he said. Tintin slipped out into an alley. Footsteps followed from the street. Two figures appeared at the alley mouth. One carried a short rifle. The other held a pistol low at his side. Tintin pressed against the brick wall. The men moved forward slowly. Their shoes scraped on the pavement. He waited until they passed the doorway. Then he ran. The first shot struck the wall behind him. Chips of brick flew past his ear. He reached the end of the alley and turned left. A car engine started nearby. Headlights swept across the sidewalk. Tintin ducked behind a stack of crates. The car rolled past without stopping. He counted to 10. Then he moved again. Snowy's bark sounded from the direction of the hotel. Tintin kept running toward the sound. Two more gunmen stepped from a doorway ahead. He changed direction and cut across an empty lot. Weeds pulled at his shoes. The men fired again. The shots went wide in the dark. A freight train rumbled on tracks nearby. Tintin climbed the low embankment. He reached the top as the engine passed. The gunmen stopped at the base of the slope. One shouted something lost in the noise. Tintin jumped onto the moving freight car. The train carried him away from the ambush. He sat with his back against the wooden side. His breath came in short pulls. The city lights slid by in streaks. Snowy would be waiting at the hotel door. Tintin folded the notebook and tucked it deeper into his pocket. The night had only begun. The wheels clacked beneath the freight car. Tintin leaned back against the rough planks. The city fell away in jagged lines of light. He touched the notebook in his pocket once more. Its pages held names and numbers that could bring down half of Chicago. The gang would not let that go. Wind rushed past the open door. It carried the smell of coal smoke and cold earth. Snowy was still at the hotel. The little dog would be pacing by the door. Tintin pictured the white terrier waiting with ears pricked. He could not go back for him yet, not until the trail cooled. The train picked up speed. Steel sang on the rails. Tintin stood and moved deeper into the car. Crates shifted with every sway. He found a narrow space between two stacks and sat again. His legs ached from the earlier chase. Stars appeared above the open roof slats. They wheeled slowly as the train curved westward. The last glow of Chicago faded behind him. In its place came open fields and the low hum of distant farms. A lantern swung at the far end of the car. Tintin froze. The light belonged to a brakeman checking the load. He pressed himself flat against a crate. The man passed without looking his way. Footsteps faded into the next car. Footsteps faded into the next car. Tintin let out a slow breath. He pulled the notebook out again. By the faint starlight, he read the top page. Addresses and meeting times filled every line. These men ran the rackets from the loop to the stockyards. One name stood out in heavier ink: Al Capone's lieutenant. The train crossed a river. Water flashed silver below the trestle. Tintin tucked the notebook away once more. He needed to reach the open country before the next stop. From there, he could send word to Snowy through a trusted contact. Hours passed in the steady rhythm of the rails. His eyes grew heavy. He fought sleep by counting the telegraph poles that flashed past the door. Each pole marked another mile from the city, another mile from the men who wanted him silenced. Dawn brought a thin line of pink across the horizon. The landscape had changed to rolling prairie. Grass bent under a fresh wind. Tintin rose and stretched his stiff limbs. He stepped to the doorway and watched the sun climb. A water tower appeared ahead. The train began to slow. Tintin knew he could not risk a station. He gathered his coat and moved to the edge of the car. When the speed dropped enough, he dropped to the gravel beside the tracks. When the speed dropped enough, he dropped to the gravel beside the train, pulled away without stopping. Tintin stood alone on the empty plain. The notebook remained safe in his pocket. Westward, the rails ran straight into new country. He began to walk toward the rising sun. The night had carried him far. The real work waited ahead. Tintin walked across the empty plain. Each step raised a small cloud of dust. The rails stretched behind him like a forgotten line. Ahead, the land rolled flat and endless. He kept the notebook deep in his coat. Its weight felt steady against his side. The sun lifted higher. Heat began to press down on the dry earth. Tintin loosened his collar. He scanned the horizon for any sign of water or shelter. Nothing moved except the faint shimmer of distance. His boots struck the hard ground in a steady rhythm. A low sound reached him from the west. Hooves drummed on the baked soil. He turned and saw 3 riders appear over a low rise. They rode hard and leaned forward in their saddles. Sunlight flashed on the barrels of their rifles. Tintin broke into a run. The plain offered no cover. The outlaws closed the gap quickly. Their shouts carried across the open space. Tintin veered toward a cluster of low rocks. He reached them and ducked behind the largest stone. A bullet struck nearby and sent chips flying. He waited for the next volley, then sprinted again. The riders split to flank him. Dust rose in thick plumes from the horses' hooves. Tintin felt the ground tremble under the chase. He spotted a narrow gully ahead and dropped into it. The walls were steep and lined with loose gravel. He scrambled along the bottom while the outlaws circled above. Their voices echoed down the cut. One man dismounted and started down on foot. Tintin pressed on. The gully twisted between rocky shoulders. He climbed out at the first bend and crossed a stretch of open ground. A canyon mouth opened to the south. He headed for it at a steady trot. Behind him, the riders regrouped and followed. Inside the canyon, the air cooled slightly. Shadows stretched across the floor. Tintin moved from boulder to boulder. The outlaws entered after him, and their calls grew louder. A shot rang out and struck the wall near his head. He ducked and kept moving. The canyon narrowed into a tight passage. He squeezed through and found a wider basin beyond. An old wooden shack stood against one wall. Tintin approached it and tried the door. It swung open on rusted hinges. Inside lay a few crates and a rusted stove. He pulled the door shut and waited. Footsteps crunched outside. The outlaws searched the basin. Their horses stamped and snorted. Tintin stayed still. Through a crack in the boards, he watched one man check the rocks. Another headed toward the shack. Tintin slipped out the back window and climbed the canyon wall. Loose stones rolled under his hands. He reached a ledge and lay flat. Below, the outlaws gathered near the shack. They argued for a moment, then mounted again. The group rode deeper into the canyon. Tintin waited until the sound faded. Then he climbed down and crossed the basin in the opposite direction. The canyon opened onto another stretch of plain. A line of low hills lay ahead. Tintin walked toward them. His throat felt dry and his legs ached. He found a small seep of water in a rocky hollow and drank. The riders had not returned. He continued into the hills as the light began to fade. Night fell over the desert. Stars appeared in the clear sky. Tintin kept moving. The hills offered better cover than the open ground. He found a sheltered spot between 2 boulders and rested. The notebook remained safe. Morning would bring new choices. Tintin continued into the hills as the light began to fade. The path grew narrow and uneven under his feet. He listened for any sign of snowy, but heard only the wind. Darkness settled quickly across the ridges. Tintin found shelter between 2 large rocks. He wrapped his coat tighter and closed his eyes. The notebook stayed pressed against his side. Morning light crept over the stones. Tintin rose and stretched. He walked onward through the dry brush. Dust rose with each step. Soon voices reached him from a hidden valley. A small camp appeared below. Tents stood in a circle. People moved among them with quiet purpose. Tintin stepped forward slowly. An elder watched him from the shade of a tree. The elder raised a hand in greeting. Tintin nodded in return. They sat together on a woven blanket. The man spoke of the land that once stretched far in every direction. Homes and herds had filled the valleys before the fences came. Tintin listened without interruption. Darkness. Children played near the water. Their laughter carried softly on the breeze. Women worked at looms and cooking fires. The elder described how treaties had been broken one after another. New roads cut through old hunting grounds. Game grew scarce. Tintin asked gentle questions. The answers came in steady, measured words. The tribe had moved many times already. Each move brought less water and poorer soil. Yet they kept their stories alive around the evening fires. Pause. Snowy appeared at the edge of the camp. He trotted forward with a limp from the night before. Tintin felt relief wash over him. The dog settled at his feet. The elder smiled at the reunion. They shared a simple meal of flatbread and dried meat. Tintin spoke of his own journey across the country. He mentioned the cities and the noise that never ended. The elder nodded with quiet understanding. Both worlds carried their own weights. Afternoon shadows lengthened across the tents. Tintin offered what little he carried in his pack. Matches and a spare knife were accepted with thanks. In return, he received a small carved token. It felt warm in his palm. He stood to leave as the sun lowered again. The elder walked with him to the ridge. No promises were made. Only respect passed between them. Tintin turned once more at the crest of the hill. The camp remained peaceful below. He continued along the trail with Snowy at his side. The notebook felt heavier now with what he had learned. Night would come again soon. The hills offered the same shelter as before. Tintin walked until the first stars appeared. Tintin reached a sheltered hollow as the first stars appeared. He laid out his blanket beside a low rock. Snowy curled at his feet. The notebook rested under his hand. Sleep came slowly under the wide sky. Morning light touched the hills. Tintin rose and checked the trail. Snowy bounded ahead. They moved deeper into the reservation lands. The air held a quiet stillness. No riders appeared on the distant ridges. By midday, the ground changed. Tintin noticed a dark patch near a dry creek bed. He knelt and touched the soil. It smelled of thick tar. Snowy pawed at the edge and backed away with a low whine. Tintin marked the spot in his notebook. He followed the seep uphill. More dark stains marked the rocks. The land sloped toward a flat basin. Tintin stood and looked across the open ground. A sudden wind stirred the grass. He felt the weight of the discovery settle in his chest. That afternoon, a distant rumble reached his ears. Dust rose on the horizon. 3 trucks rolled into view. Men in city coats climbed down and began to pace the basin. One carried a long metal rod and drove it into the earth. Another shouted orders. Snowy growled softly. Tintin pulled the dog into the cover of a stand of trees. The men worked quickly. They hammered stakes and stretched wire. A tall figure in a dark hat pointed toward the seep Tintin had found. Voices carried on the wind. Talk of leases and rights and quick fortunes filled the air. Tintin listened without moving. The notebook felt heavier again. One of the men lit a cigarette and laughed. He said the Indians would not know the value until it was too late. Another answered that the law could be bent with enough money. Tintin noted the names they used. The trucks carried equipment for drilling. The basin would not stay quiet for long. As the sun lowered, the men drove away. Tintin waited until the dust settled. He walked down to the stakes they had left. Snowy sniffed each one and sneezed. The wire hummed faintly in the evening breeze. Tintin pulled one stake free and carried it back to the trees. He needed proof before the next day. Night returned to the hills. Tintin sat with his back to the rock. Snowy rested close. The stars appeared once more. Far below, a single light flickered where the men had camped. Tintin closed the notebook. The land around him waited in silence. Tintin opened his eyes to the dark slope. The rock felt cold against his shoulders. Snowy lifted his head and listened. Below them, the single light still burned. Tintin stood slowly. He checked the notebook one last time. Then he tucked it away. They moved down the hill without sound. Loose stones shifted under their feet. Tintin kept low among the scrub. Snowy stayed close at his heel. The light grew brighter as they neared the camp. 2 men sat by the fire. Their rifles rested against a log. Tintin paused behind a boulder. He watched them talk in low voices. A 3rd man stepped out from the trees. He carried a coil of rope. The others stood up at once. Tintin felt a hand clamp over his mouth from behind. Strong arms pulled him backward. Snowy barked once before a boot silenced him. The boy struggled, but the grip was tight. They bound his wrists quickly. A sack dropped over his head. The outlaws dragged him through the brush. Branches scraped his arms. Snowy's muffled whines followed close behind. They reached a wooden shack at the edge of the clearing. The door creaked open. Tintin was pushed inside and forced onto a chair. The sack came off. Lantern lights stung his eyes. 3 men stood over him. One of them lit a cigarette. He spoke in a flat voice. They wanted to know what he had seen on the ridge. Tintin stayed quiet. The man struck a match and held it near his face. Snowy growled from a corner where he had been tied. Tintin met the outlaw's stare without flinching. He asked for water first. The request brought a moment of confusion. They gave him a tin cup. Tintin drank slowly. He watched how the men moved around the room. One kept checking the door. Another cleaned his revolver on the table. Tintin noticed the key ring hanging from the guard's belt. He began to talk about the hills instead. He described a false trail that led north. The men listened. Their attention shifted to the map he sketched with words. Snowy worked at his own rope in the shadows. The knot loosened bit by bit. Tintin kept speaking. He claimed he had buried the notebook under a marked stone. The outlaws argued over who would go fetch it. One finally stood and left. The remaining 2 grew restless. Tintin asked for another drink. While they turned away, he slipped his bound hands over the chair back. The rope stretched. Snowy slipped free first. The dog darted forward and nipped the nearest leg. The man stumbled. Tintin lunged with the chair still attached to his wrists. The lantern crashed to the floor. Flames licked the dry boards. Smoke filled the small space. The outlaws coughed and reached for their guns. Tintin kicked the door open with his heel. He and Snowy ran into the night. Behind them, the shack caught fire. Shouts rose from the clearing. Tintin kept his wrists low and worked the knot against a sharp branch. The rope gave way after several pulls. He untied Snowy's collar next. They climbed back toward the ridge. The stars had shifted. Dawn was still far off. Tintin listened for pursuit but heard only the crackle of burning wood. He stopped at the first flat rock. Snowy panted beside him. The notebook was still safe in his pocket. Tintin opened it again and added a quick line about the camp. Then he closed it. The hills waited in silence once more. He started walking toward the road that led south. Snowy trotted ahead to scout the path. Their footsteps faded into the dark. Tintin kept moving south along the narrow road. Snowy stayed a few paces ahead. The hills stood dark and quiet on either side. Far from the road, in a hidden clearing among the rocks, 3 figures from the tribe gathered in low voices. They had watched the strangers take the reporter away. One of them, a tall man with a steady gaze, drew a line in the dirt with a stick. He marked the camp where the gangsters held their prisoner. The others leaned close. Their plan took shape slowly. They would wait until the moon climbed higher. Then 2 would circle the outer tents while the third slipped inside. No guns, only ropes and quiet feet. The reporter had helped their people once before. They would not leave him behind. Back on the road, Tintin paused to listen. Snowy's ears twitched. Nothing stirred. He checked the notebook once more and slipped it away. The south road stretched empty under the stars. In the clearing, the tallest man stood. He pointed to the east ridge. That path would bring them above the camp without being seen. The second man nodded and checked the length of rope coiled at his belt. The third, younger, tested the edge of his knife against his thumb. They moved out single file. Their moccasins made no sound on the stone. Far from Tintin reached a bend where the road dipped into shadow. Snowy stopped suddenly. A low growl rumbled in the dog's throat. Tintin crouched and placed a hand on Snowy's back. Footsteps approached from the darkness ahead. 2 men in city coats walked without hurry. Their voices carried fragments of talk about a reward. Tintin drew back against the rock wall. Snowy stayed silent. The men passed and continued north. The 3 rescuers reached the ridge. Below them, the gangster camp showed as scattered lights. Tents stood in uneven rows. A single guard leaned against a post near the largest tent. The tall man signaled. They split, one moving left, one right, the third staying high to watch. Time slowed as they waited for the guard to shift position. Tintin left the road and cut across open ground. He hoped to reach the river before dawn. Snowy trotted at his heel now. The land felt wider here. A thin wind stirred the dry grass. Down in the camp, the guard finally moved away from the post. He walked toward the cookfire for coffee. The rescuer on the left slipped forward. He reached the back of the largest tent and lifted the canvas an inch. Inside, a lantern burned low. Tintin's hat lay on an upturned crate. The reporter himself was not there. The man withdrew and signaled the others. They would need to search further. Tintin crossed a dry wash. Stones shifted under his boots. Snowy jumped the narrow gap. On the far side, the ground rose again toward another line of hills. Tintin paused to catch his breath. He wondered how far the gang would search once they noticed he was gone. The three allies moved between tents. They avoided the circles of light. One checked an empty supply tent. Another listened at a closed flap. Voices inside spoke of the reporter's escape. The men inside sounded angry. The rescuer backed away. They regrouped near a stack of crates. The tall man pointed toward a smaller tent set apart from the others. That one had two guards sitting outside. Tintin climbed the next slope. His legs ached from the long walk. Snowy stayed close. At the top, he looked back. Distant lights marked the camp he had left behind. He turned and kept going. The rescuers waited for a change in the guard's routine. One guard stood and stretched. The other lit a cigarette. The young ally moved first. He circled behind the small tent and cut a slit in the canvas with his knife. He peered inside. The space was empty except for a bedroll and a lantern. No reporter. He sealed the cut with a strip of cloth and withdrew. The three men exchanged glances. Their plan had to change. Tintin reached a stand of scrub pine. He rested against a trunk. Snowy lay down at his feet. The dog's breathing was steady. Tintin opened the notebook again and added a few words about the direction he had taken. He closed it and stood. The night still felt endless. The allies decided to split once more. One would watch the main path out of camp. The other two would check the vehicles parked at the edge of the clearing. Perhaps the reporter had been moved into one of the trucks. They moved with care. The tall man reached the first truck and looked through the side window. Empty. He tried the next. Also empty. A faint sound made him freeze. Footsteps approached from the camp. He dropped low behind the wheel. Tintin walked on. The ground leveled into a wide, flat stretch. Snowy suddenly veered left. Tintin followed. A shallow gully offered cover. They slid down into it and waited. The sound of an engine drifted from the road above. A car passed without slowing. The tall man stayed hidden until the footsteps faded. He signaled his companions. They had seen enough. The reporter was not in the camp. They would track him south instead. The three men left the vehicles and headed toward the road. Their pace was steady. They knew the land and moved with purpose. Tintin kept to the gully until the engine sound died away. He climbed out and continued. Snowy trotted ahead again. The first pale hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. The road curved once more. In the distance, the river glinted. Tintin adjusted his coat and walked on. Behind him, the three allies reached the same road and turned south as well. Their footsteps joined the quiet of the night. Tintin kept his eyes on the glinting river. Snowy stayed close to his side. The dawn light grew a little stronger with each step. The road ran straight now toward a cluster of low buildings. Somewhere ahead, the crime boss waited. Tintin checked the revolver in his pocket once more. The three allies followed at a distance. Their boots made almost no sound on the hard earth. Tintin reached the first wooden fence and paused to listen. A dog barked once inside the compound and fell silent. Snowy pricked his ears but did not answer. Tintin slipped through a gap in the boards. The main house stood at the center of the yard. Smoke rose from a single chimney. Tintin moved along the wall until he found a window. Through the glass, he saw the crime boss seated at a table. The man counted stacks of money with slow, deliberate fingers. Two bodyguards stood nearby with rifles across their arms. Tintin drew a deep breath. He stepped to the door and knocked once. The sound echoed in the quiet morning air. Inside the room, the counting stopped. Footsteps approached from the other side. The door opened a few inches. A bodyguard peered out. His eyes widened at the sight of Tintin. Before he could shout, Tintin pushed the door wide and entered. The second bodyguard swung his rifle up. Tintin raised his own revolver. Put it down. The man hesitated, then lowered the weapon. The crime boss remained seated. He looked Tintin over without rising. So the reporter finally caught up. His voice carried a calm threat. Tintin kept his gun steady. The game ends here. You have taken enough from this country. The boss smiled faintly. He gestured to the money on the table. All of this could be yours if you walk away. Tintin shook his head once. The offer changes nothing. Behind him, the door creaked again. The three allies entered and spread out across the room. The bodyguards glanced at one another. Their rifles stayed on the floor. The crime boss leaned back in his chair. You think these friends will save you? Tintin answered without lowering his weapon. They came because the law failed. Today, the law arrives with me. A long silence filled the room. Snowy growled low from the doorway. The boss reached slowly for a cigar. Tintin watched every movement. The cigar was lit, and the first puff of smoke rose. You have courage, reporter. That will not be enough. Outside the compound, a siren sounded in the distance. The allies shifted their positions. One of them tied the bodyguard's hands with rope from his belt. The crime boss watched the preparations with narrowed eyes. He stubbed out the cigar. Very well. Take me if you must. Tintin stepped forward and removed the revolver from the table. The boss stood at last. His hands remained visible. The group moved toward the door together. Dawn had fully arrived, and the river shone bright under the new sun. Snowy led the way back through the fence gap. The allies followed with the prisoners between them. Tintin kept the crime boss in front of him at all times. No words passed for several minutes. Only the sound of footsteps and the distant siren grew louder. The confrontation had ended without a single shot. The road ahead led toward the waiting authorities. Tintin adjusted his coat once more. He felt the weight of the morning settle around them. The case was closed at last. Behind the group, the compound stood empty and silent. The river continued its steady flow toward the horizon.
Tintin turned from the river's edge.
The morning light felt heavier now. He sensed eyes watching from the trees beyond the compound. The road to the authorities no longer seemed safe. A distant engine coughed to life. Men in dark coats stepped from the shadows. Their voices carried low and urgent. Tintin adjusted his coat once more. Snowy pressed close to his leg. The dog sensed the change too. Without a word, they slipped behind a line of rocks. The first shot cracked the air. It struck the dirt where they had stood. They ran. The terrain rose quickly into low hills. Pine trees closed around them. Branches snapped under hurried feet. Another shot echoed. It came from farther back. Tintin kept low. Snowy darted ahead. Without a word, the hills grew steeper. Loose stones rolled under their boots. Tintin grabbed a root to steady himself. His breath came in short pulls. The mountains waited ahead. They offered cover, but no safety yet. Narrow trail appeared between two boulders. Tintin followed it. Snowy stayed at his side. The path wound upward. It led into thicker forest. Sunlight broke through in thin shafts. Voices rose behind them. The pursuers had found the trail. Tintin quickened his pace. A ravine opened on the left. Its edge dropped sharp and sudden. He moved away from it. One misstep would end the flight. The air cooled as they climbed. Wind stirred the pines. Tintin paused behind a fallen trunk. He listened. Footsteps crunched on the slope below. They were gaining. Snowy growled softly. Tintin placed a hand on the dog's head. Silence returned for a moment. They pressed on. The ground turned rocky. Small streams cut across the path. Water splashed under their steps. Tintin felt the weight of the morning return. The case had seemed closed, yet the danger had only shifted. A cliff face rose ahead. It blocked the direct route. Tintin searched for a way around. He found a ledge that ran sideways. It looked narrow. He tested it with one foot. Snowy waited. The dog followed when the boy moved. Halfway across the ledge, a stone gave way. It tumbled into the drop below. The sound echoed. Voices answered from the trail. Tintin froze. He pressed against the rock wall. Snowy stayed still. The pursuers passed beneath without looking up. Halfway, the ledge ended at a slope of loose shale. Tintin slid down carefully. His hands gripped the earth. Snowy scrambled beside him. They reached a small clearing. Tall grass swayed in the wind. Tintin caught his breath. The mountains stretched farther now. Peaks stood sharp against the sky. He checked his coat pocket. The notebook remained safe. Evidence from the compound could still matter if he reached the right people. If he reached the right people. If he reached the right people. Snowy sniffed the air. A new sound reached them. It was the rush of a larger river. Tintin moved toward it. The water could mask their trail. They descended through more trees. Roots tangled across the ground. At the riverbank, the water ran fast. White foam marked hidden rocks. Tintin found a shallow crossing. He stepped in. Cold water pulled at his legs. Snowy swam beside him. They reached the far side. The opposite bank offered thicker cover. Tintin climbed a short rise. From there he looked back. No one followed yet. The flight had bought time, but the terrain remained wild. He chose a new direction. It led deeper into the range. The path grew faint. Pines gave way to open ridges. Wind swept across them. Tintin pulled his coat tighter. Snowy found a sheltered spot under an overhang. They rested there. The rock felt cool. Tintin listened to the mountain sounds. Distant bird calls. The river below. No engines. No voices. He stood again. The day was not done. The mountains held more ground to cross. Tintin walked on. Snowy stayed close. The wild terrain opened before them. Each step carried them farther from the road and the men who had turned back. Distant light faded on the ridges. Tintin found a flat area among the rocks. He settled for the night. The escape had only begun. The mountains would test them further. Yet the first narrow path had held. The wild terrain opened before them. Each step carried them farther from the road and the men who had turned back. Light faded on the ridges. Tintin found a flat area among the rocks. He settled for the night. The escape had only begun. The mountains would test them further. Yet the first narrow path had held. Morning light crept across the slopes. Tintin rose and checked his small pack. Snow clung to the higher ground. He moved onward with careful steps. The trail wound between boulders and thin pines. Behind him, the gangsters still hunted. Hours passed in steady silence. A distant shout echoed once. Tintin pressed against a cliff face. The voices drew nearer. He waited until they passed below. Then he climbed higher. By midday, the sky cleared. The air grew sharp. Tintin reached a narrow ridge. From there, he saw the valley floor far below. A river cut through it like a silver thread. No sign of rescue showed yet. He continued along the ridge. Loose stones shifted under his boots. One foot slipped. He caught himself on a jutting root. The drop yawned beside him. Breath came steady again. Late afternoon brought new movement. Figures appeared on a lower trail. They wore the dark coats of the city gang. Tintin crouched behind a stand of scrub. One man pointed upward. The group split and began to climb. From there, he saw the valley floor far below. The path narrowed to a ledge. He edged forward. Below, the gangsters called to one another, their voices carried on the wind. He reached a wider shelf and paused to listen. The sun dipped toward the western peaks. Shadows lengthened across the rock. Tintin found a cleft in the stone. He slipped inside and waited. Footsteps scraped on the ledge outside. Two men passed without noticing the opening. Night fell once more. Cold settled into the cleft. Tintin ate the last of his bread. He thought of the city far behind. The gang had ruled those streets too long. Here the mountains offered no shelter for them. Light fade at first light he emerged. Fresh tracks marked the snow ahead. He followed at a distance. The gangsters moved in a line. Their leader barked orders that echoed faintly. Tintin kept low and watched. The trail led to a wide bowl between peaks. A small cabin stood at its center. Smoke rose from the chimney. The men approached the door. Tintin circled the rim and found a vantage point. He settled among the rocks to observe. Shots rang out without warning. The gang leader fell first. Others scattered toward the trees. Uniformed men appeared from the cabin. Federal agents moved with steady purpose. The remaining gangsters raised their hands. Tintin stood and waved from the ridge. An agent spotted him and signaled back. The chase ended there in the high bowl. Justice had crossed the mountains at last. The men who had fled the city now stood in cuffs. Their empire lay broken on the snow. The agents led the prisoners down the trail. Tintin descended to join them. Handshakes passed among the group. The cold wind still blew across the peaks. Yet the reckoning felt complete. The mountains had given up their secrets.
Tintin watched the last prisoner vanish around the bend in the trail.
Snowy trotted close at his heels. The young reporter drew a slow breath of the thin mountain air. Memories crowded forward now that the chase had ended. He recalled the first hours in Chicago. Neon signs had flashed above crowded sidewalks. Gangsters had waited in every shadow. A single wrong turn had led straight into their hands. Yet he had escaped with Snowy and kept moving forward. The city had tested every step. Further west, the land had opened into endless plains. Tintin remembered the small towns where strangers offered help one moment and betrayal the next. He had followed clues through dusty saloons and quiet farms. Each clue had pulled him deeper into danger. The train rides between cities had given brief moments of rest. Snowy had slept on the seat beside him while the landscape rolled past. Then came the mountains themselves. The cold peaks had hidden the final hideout. Tintin had climbed through snow and wind. He had faced the last desperate stand alone until the agents arrived. Now the same peaks stood behind him. The wind still whispered across the ridges. With anyone has been saying to no end. He thought of the people he had met along the way. Some had shown courage in the face of threats. Others had chosen silence to protect themselves. A few had tried to warn him in time. Their faces drifted through his mind like pages in a notebook. He wondered what stories they would tell once the headlines faded. His journey back began at the foot of the trail. Jeeps waited on the narrow road. Tintin climbed into the lead vehicle with Snowy on his lap. The road wound downward through pine forests. Sunlight broke through the trees in long shafts. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the motion carry him. Days later, the group reached the rail station in the valley. Handshakes and quiet thanks passed between Tintin and the agents. The prisoners had already been moved under heavy guard. Tintin boarded the train with Snowy and watched the platform slide away. The click of the wheels settled into a steady rhythm. Fields and rivers passed outside the window. He pulled out his battered notebook and flipped through the pages. Sketches of Chicago streets mixed with maps of Indian lands. Notes about oil wells and hidden tunnels filled the margins. Each line reminded him of a narrow escape. He added a final line about the mountain confrontation. Then he closed the book and slipped it into his coat. Snowy nudged his hand for attention. Tintin scratched behind the dog's ears. The faithful companion had stayed beside him through every chase. Together they had crossed rivers and outrun cars. The bond felt stronger now than when they first arrived. The train reached the coast after another long day.
Salt air met them at the station. Suddenly, Tintin carried his small suitcase down to the docks. The ship that would carry them home stood ready at the pier. Gulls wheeled overhead and called into the wind. Crew members moved crates along the gangway. Tintin paused at the bottom of the ramp. He looked back toward the distant horizon where the mountains still rose. America had given him more than danger. It had shown the reach of greed and the quiet strength of ordinary people. He felt ready to carry those lessons home. Snowy barked once at the water. Tintin smiled and started up the gangway. The sea waited beyond the harbor mouth. The adventure in America had reached its close. Home lay ahead across the waves.